I watched Robert's eyes light up as Brooke laughed at his joke, the same mediocre joke he'd been recycling at dinner parties for years. At 32, with honey blonde hair cascading over bare shoulders, she was everything I apparently wasn't anymore. I sipped my wine and observed as my husband of 15 years leaned closer to her, lowering his voice to a whisper that made her giggle again. "Miranda, the salmon is divine," Caroline commented beside me, her eyes darting between me and the spectacle my husband was making of himself across the room. "Did you use a new recipe?" "Just an old family secret," I replied, forcing a smile. In truth, the catering company had prepared everything. I'd been too busy securing the Anderson account to cook for Robert's law firm partners. The Anderson account. My secret victory. Not that Robert had bothered to ask about my work in months. When had that changed? When had his questions about my day turned into monologues about his latest courtroom triumph? "Robert says you've been absolutely crushing it at work lately," Caroline continued, her voice carrying that particular tone reserved for discussing the terminally ill. News of my marriage's deterioration had clearly made the rounds. "Business is good," I replied neutrally, watching Robert's hand find the small of Brooke's back, his new paralegal with a fresh law degree and ambitions as substantial as her Instagram following. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." At 43, I was CEO of Emerson Financial Advisors, managing over $2 billion in assets for our exclusive clientele. A fact that used to make Robert proud when we first met, back when he was a struggling attorney with student loans threatening to drown him. Back when my connections and capital had saved his floundering career. "Miranda, darling," Robert's voice boomed as he approached, Brooke trailing behind him like a perfumed shadow. "Have you met Brooke properly? She's been an absolute revelation at the firm. The way she organized the Westfield case files, pure genius." I extended my hand, meeting her perfectly manicured grip with my own. "We've met briefly," I said. "At the Christmas party." "Oh, right," she chirped, her eyes widening with practiced innocence. "You're Robert's wife." The slight pause before wife wasn't accidental. Nothing about Brooke was accidental. 15 years next month, I replied, watching Robert's face for any recognition of our upcoming anniversary. There was none. "How nice," she said, turning to Robert. "I need your input on that brief for Judge Hannigan. Do you have a minute to discuss it before I head out?" "Of course," Robert replied too quickly. "Business never sleeps, right, Miranda? You understand?" I did understand. More than he realized. "Don't let me keep you," I said, raising my glass slightly. "Duty calls." I watched them walk away, heads bent together in conversation, and wondered when exactly I'd become an obstacle rather than a partner in my own marriage. Caroline squeezed my arm gently. "Men can be such fools," she whispered. I nodded absently, my mind already calculating next steps. Not out of desperation to save my marriage, that ship had clearly sailed, but out of a lifetime habit of strategic planning. I didn't build Emerson Financial by reacting emotionally to market fluctuations. I built it by anticipating them, preparing, and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And Robert Saxon was becoming a very predictable market indeed. 3 weeks later, I sat in my corner office overlooking downtown, reviewing quarterly projections when my phone buzzed with a text from Robert. "Need to talk. Tonight. Important. No pleasantries. No inquiry about my day. Just a demand for my attention when it suited him." I set the phone down without replying and returned to the Anderson portfolio. Across from me, my CFO Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" "Just Robert," I said, making a notation on the document. "Probably wants to tell me he'll be working late again." Marcus had been with me since the beginning, when Emerson Financial was just 3 desks in a rented office space. He knew Robert before the tailored suits and the corner office at Saxon and Reed Law Partners, before the Rolex and the Tesla and the summer home in the Hamptons. "How are things on that front?" he asked carefully, ever the diplomat. I met his gaze. "Exactly as expected." He nodded, understanding the implication. Marcus knew me well enough to recognize when I'd made a decision. "I've got those trust structures you asked for," he said, smoothly changing the subject as he slid a folder across my desk, including the blind options. "Thank you," I replied, opening the file. "This is very thorough." I also included the contact information for Diane Levinson. She handled my sister's situation last year. Very discreet, very thorough. Diane Levinson, the divorce attorney who'd secured his sister a settlement that made headlines in financial circles. I tucked the information away mentally. "Just a contingency," I said. Marcus nodded. Always good to have options. By 7 that evening, I'd prepared a light dinner, opened a bottle of Robert's favorite wine, and fortified myself for whatever conversation was coming. When I heard his key in the door at 8:30, an hour later than he'd texted he would be home, I was sitting at our dining table, casually reviewing reports on my tablet. "Sorry I'm late," he said, loosening his tie as he entered. He didn't offer an explanation. "Is that Merlot?" "Your favorite," I confirmed, watching him pour a generous glass before taking his seat across from me. He took a long drink before setting the glass down and meeting my eyes. "Miranda, we need to talk." "So your text indicated," I replied, setting my tablet aside. He cleared his throat. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately. About us. About where we are in life. 15 years of marriage had taught me to recognize his courtroom voice. This wasn't a conversation. It was a prepared statement. "And?" I prompted when he paused for dramatic effect. "I think we've grown apart," he continued. "We want different things. We're living parallel lives under the same roof." I took a sip of wine, allowing him the space to continue his practiced speech. "I'll always care for you, Miranda. You've been an important part of my life. But I'm not happy anymore, and I don't think you are either." "And what would make you happy, Robert?" I asked, already knowing the answer. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I think we both deserve a chance to find what makes us truly happy, even if that's not with each other." "Does what makes you happy have a name?" I asked, my voice perfectly steady. He flinched. "This isn't about anyone else. This is about us." "Is it? Miranda, please. I'm trying to be honest with you." "Then be completely honest," I said. "Is there someone else?" His hesitation told me everything I needed to know. "I've developed feelings for someone," he finally admitted. "I didn't plan it. It just happened." "Brooke," I said, not bothering to frame it as a question. He nodded, having the grace to look slightly ashamed. "It's not what you think. It's not just physical. She understands me. We connect on a deeper level." I suppressed a laugh. The cliché of it all was almost impressive. "And have you and Brooke discussed your future plans?" "We have," he said, straightening slightly. "We want to be together. I'm going to move out this weekend." Despite having anticipated this exact conversation, hearing him say the words aloud sent a sharp pain through my chest. 15 years of shared history, disposed of for a woman he'd known less than 6 months. "I see," I said, taking another sip of wine to compose myself. "And what exactly are you proposing for our situation?" This was the part I was most curious about. Robert had always been strategic, calculating. It's what made him a good attorney. It's also what made him predictable to someone who knew him as well as I did. "I've spoken with my lawyer," he said, professional mode fully engaged now. "I think we can handle this amicably. We don't have children to consider, which simplifies things." "That's true," I acknowledged. Our mutual decision not to have children had been one of the few things we'd completely agreed upon throughout our marriage. I propose we each retain what we brought into the marriage and split our joint assets equally, he continued. The house would be sold, and we'd divide the proceeds. I raised an eyebrow. The house I purchased 2 years before we met? The one that's solely in my name? He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. You have to admit I've contributed significantly to its upkeep and renovations, with money earned from the firm where my connections secured your partnership, I reminded him. Miranda, please. I'm trying to be fair here. Are you? I asked, genuinely curious if he believed that. Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you want to leave me for your paralegal while taking half of everything I've built. His expression hardened. Everything we've built. I've supported your career every step of the way. I set my glass down carefully. Robert, let me be clear. I will not contest the divorce. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. But if you think you're entitled to half of Emerson Financial or this house, you're greatly mistaken. I've consulted with Thomas, he said, referencing his law partner. The law is quite clear on marital assets in this state. Then perhaps you should consult with him again, I replied calmly. And this time remind him to review our prenuptial agreement, the one your firm drafted, if I recall correctly. I watched the realization dawn on his face. The prenup had been his idea 15 years ago, a young attorney protecting himself from what he perceived as my family money. The irony that it would now protect me from him wasn't lost on either of us. That was a lifetime ago, he argued, voice rising slightly. Before I helped you build Emerson into what it is today. Helped me? I repeated, genuinely surprised by his revision of history. In what capacity exactly? My connections brought you half your client roster, he countered. Your connections that I cultivated through charity boards and fundraisers that you reluctantly attended. I clarified. The same connections you complained about networking with every time I asked you to join me? He stood abruptly, pacing the dining room. This is exactly why things aren't working between us. You've always minimized my contributions. I remained seated, watching him. This reaction, too, was predictable. Robert had always rewritten history to cast himself as the hero of every story. I think we should both take some time to cool off, I suggested. You've made your position clear. I've made mine clear. Perhaps our lawyers should handle the details from here. Fine, he snapped, grabbing his wine glass and draining it. I'll be staying at the Westlake downtown tonight. I'll come by this weekend to get some of my things. I'll make sure I'm not here, I replied, not wanting to witness him packing up. Our life together. He paused at the dining room doorway. For what it's worth, I never meant to hurt you. I looked at him, truly looked at the man I'd spent 15 years with, and realized I barely recognized him anymore. Or perhaps I was finally seeing him clearly for the first time. Intentional or not, I said quietly, the outcome remains the same. After the door closed behind him, I sat in the silence of my dining room, finishing my wine and considering the path ahead. The pain was real. I wouldn't deny that. 15 years wasn't erased overnight, regardless of how clinically I could analyze the situation. I picked up my phone and scrolled to the contact information Marcus had provided. Diane Levinson's office, a crisp voice answered. This is Miranda Emerson, I replied. I'd like to schedule a consultation regarding a divorce. As I hung up, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. Robert thought he knew what he was doing, thought he understood the game he was playing. But in his rush to begin his new life with Brooke, he'd forgotten one crucial detail. I had always been better at long-term strategy than he was, and I had been planning for this contingency longer than he realized. Opening my laptop, I pulled up the secure folder containing documents I'd been compiling for the past 8 months, since the night I'd first noticed Brooke's name appearing with increasing frequency in his texts and emails. Not that I'd been snooping. Robert had always been careless with his passwords, Another detail that revealed how little he truly respected my intelligence. Inside the folder were financial records, property deeds, investment portfolios, and a series of shell companies that Robert knew nothing about. Companies that, unbeknownst to him, had been quietly funding the expansion of Saxon and Reed Law Partners for the past 3 years. I hadn't built these structures out of suspicion or malice. I'd created them because I understood something fundamental about wealth that Robert never had. True financial security required invisibility. Robert wanted his freedom? He could have it. But he would soon discover just how dependent his success had been on the wife he so eagerly discarded. I closed the laptop and poured another glass of wine. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations, painful realizations, and the first steps toward dismantling a 15-year partnership. But tonight, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of his betrayal, knowing it would be the fuel that carried me through what was to come. Because while Robert was planning his weekend move to a downtown apartment with his young girlfriend, I was preparing to reveal just how thoroughly he'd miscalculated the woman he thought he knew. The morning after Robert's confession, I arrived at my office earlier than usual. Sleep had been elusive, despite the 3 glasses of wine and emotional exhaustion. I'd spent most of the night reviewing documents, refreshing my understanding of our prenuptial agreement, and preparing for my appointment with Diane Levinson later that day. "You look like hell," Marcus observed bluntly as he placed a cup of strong black coffee on my desk. It was our routine for 15 years. I arrived first. He brought coffee. We discussed priorities before the rest of the staff trickled in. "Thank you for that astute observation," I replied, taking a grateful sip. He sat across from me, his expression softening. "It happened, didn't it?" I nodded, too tired for pretense. "Last night. He's moving out this weekend." Marcus leaned back, absorbing this information. "And you're sure about this? About letting him go?" The question caught me off guard. In all my calculations and contingency planning, I hadn't considered fighting for my marriage. Was that strange? Perhaps. But the trust was irreparably broken, and I'd never been one to invest in failing assets. "He's already gone, Marcus. Has been for months." I pulled up a secure folder on my computer. "I need you to execute Phase 1 of the contingency plan today." Marcus nodded. "All business now." "The Saxon and Reed investment restructuring?" "Yes. Transfer the Cayman holdings to the Singapore entity and freeze the quarterly disbursements to the operating account. Don't terminate anything yet. Just delay. Blame it on compliance reviews if anyone asks." "They'll feel the pinch within 30 days, he noted, making notes on his tablet. "That's the idea? Subtle enough to create concern, but not panic. I want Robert distracted but functional. And the domestic accounts?" I hesitated, considering. "Leave those untouched for now. I don't want to alert him to anything unusual until after our initial legal discussions." Marcus nodded, understanding my strategy. "Your meeting with Levinson, is it 2? "Yes, I'll need you to cover the Peterson call. Already rescheduled for tomorrow morning. I told them you were deep in quarterly reviews." This was why Marcus had been my right hand for 15 years. He anticipated needs before I voiced them. "There's something else," I said, pulling a sealed envelope from my bag. "I need you to deliver this to Victoria Chen." Marcus raised an eyebrow. Victoria Chen was the managing partner at Clark, Chen & Associates, Saxon and Reed's primary competitor, and the firm handling the opposite side of the Westfield case that Robert and Brooke were currently working on. "Is this what I think it is?" he asked, taking the envelope carefully. "It's information that would be of particular interest to Victoria regarding the Westfield strategy." "Nothing confidential," I clarified. "Just public records that her research team seems to have overlooked." "Records that might significantly impact Robert's case?" "Records that might make Victoria look more closely at the young paralegal working with Robert," I corrected. "The one whose previous internship at a related entity wasn't disclosed in discovery." Marcus's eyes widened slightly. "Brooke worked for a Westfield subsidiary?" 6 months at a foundation funded entirely by Westfield International. Nothing illegal about it, but certainly something that should have been disclosed. An oversight that Victoria would be very interested to discover. An oversight that could potentially damage Robert's standing with the firm if it came to light, Marcus observed, tucking the envelope into his jacket pocket. Precisely. Miranda, Marcus said carefully, are you sure you want to play it this way? You could walk away with half of everything without any of this maneuvering. I met his concerned gaze. This isn't about money, Marcus. It's about consequences. He nodded, understanding. Just be careful. Revenge has a way of consuming the vengeful. This isn't revenge, I corrected. It's correction. Robert believes his success is entirely self-made. He needs to understand exactly what he's walking away from, and who he's walking away from before. I let him go. Diane Levinson's office was exactly what I expected. Understated elegance that whispered of old money and discretion. The woman herself was a surprise, however. I'd pictured someone like me, mid-40s, polished, reserved. Instead, I found myself facing a petite woman in her 60s with a shock of silver hair cut in a severe bob and electric blue reading glasses perched on her nose. So, she said after I'd outlined my situation, another middle-aged man throwing away a perfectly good marriage for a younger model. How original. Despite everything, I found myself smiling. I suppose we're all clichés in the end. Speak for yourself, dear, she replied, removing her glasses. Now, you mentioned a prenuptial agreement? I slid the document across her desk. Drafted by his firm 15 years ago. He was concerned about protecting himself from my family money. She scanned the document, a small smile playing at her lips. Oh, this is delicious. Did he even read this before signing? It was his firm's standard template at the time, I explained. I suspect he assumed it was equally protective for both parties. Well, he assumed incorrectly, Diane said, flipping to a highlighted section. This clause essentially limits his claim to only joint assets acquired during the marriage that were purchased with commingled funds. Since your business predated the marriage and you've maintained separate finances. He gets virtually nothing, I finished. The house is in my name, purchased before we met. The vacation properties are owned by my holding company. Emerson Financial was established 5 years before our marriage. What about his law firm? Saxon and Reed? He joined as an associate 3 years after we married. Made partner 4 years after that. The firm itself was established in 1978. She made a note. And did you invest in the firm at any point? This was where things became complicated. Not directly, I said carefully. But through a series of investment vehicles that Robert isn't aware of, I control approximately 30% of their operating capital. Diane's pen paused mid-stroke. Does he know this? No. The investments were made through shell companies based in Singapore and the Cayman Islands. On paper, they appear to be real estate investment trusts interested in the firm's office properties. Are these legitimate investments? Completely legal and properly documented, I assured her. I've had 3 separate firms verify the structures. She leaned back, studying me with newfound appreciation. Miranda, most of my clients come to me after the fact, trying to salvage what they can from a broken marriage. You appear to have been preparing for this eventuality for some time. I believe in contingency planning, I said simply, clearly. She shuffled her papers, organizing them neatly. Based on this prenuptial agreement alone, we're in an extremely strong position. Robert would be entitled only to half of your joint. Checking and investment accounts, the art and furniture purchased during the marriage, and possibly some retirement assets, depending on how they were funded. And what would he argue for beyond that? He might try to claim that his contributions to your business were substantial enough to warrant equity compensation, but that's a difficult argument given your prenup language. She tapped her pen against the document. His best strategy would be to challenge the validity of the prenup itself. On what grounds? Coercion, inadequate disclosure, lack of separate representation, the usual tactics. None particularly strong in your case since his own firm drafted it and you both had separate counsel. I nodded, processing this information. And the firm? Investments? How should we handle those? Diane studied me carefully. That depends entirely on what outcome you're seeking, Miranda. Are you looking to punish Robert, bankrupt his firm, or simply protect what's yours? The question gave me pause. What did I want? When I'd started planning these financial contingencies, years ago, it had been purely defensive, a way to ensure I wouldn't be vulnerable if the marriage ended. But now, faced with the reality of Robert's betrayal, I found my motivations less clear. I want him to recognize the consequences of his choices, I said finally. I want him to understand exactly what he's throwing away. And yes, I admitted, part of me wants him to struggle, at least temporarily. But you don't want to destroy him completely, she observed. No, I agreed after a moment's reflection. That would be disproportionate. Diane nodded, seemingly satisfied with my answer. Then I suggest a gradual approach. First, we proceed with a straightforward divorce filing based on the prenup. Let him believe that's the extent of his exposure. Meanwhile, you can begin slowly unwinding your investments in his firm. Not all at once, but enough to create some operational challenges. That's already in motion, I confirmed. Good. Then we wait for his response. If he accepts the terms of the prenup and proceeds amicably, perhaps those firm investments continue or even increase. If he decides to fight, then the investments accelerate their withdrawal, I finished. Precisely. Your leverage isn't in the divorce proceedings themselves. It's in your ability to impact his professional future while remaining completely within legal boundaries. I felt a strange sense of relief hearing my strategy validated by this seasoned professional. So we file the standard papers and wait for his counter? Yes, but we should be prepared for his reaction when he realizes how little he's entitled to under the prenup. Men like Robert rarely accept limitations gracefully. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text from Robert. Just met with Thomas. We need to talk tonight. This prenup situation is ridiculous after 15 years. I showed Diane the message, and she smiled. Right on schedule. Would you like my advice on how to handle this conversation? Please, don't have it, she said simply. Every word between you now should go through counsel. Text him back that you're meeting with your attorney, and all communication should go through proper channels. I composed the message as she suggested, adding that I'd be unavailable for the weekend as he moved his things out. After sending it, I looked up to find Diane watching me with an odd expression. What is it? I asked. In my 35 years practicing family law, I've rarely encountered someone as controlled as you appear to be, Miranda. Most clients in your position are emotional wrecks by this stage. I considered her observation. I'm not saying I don't feel things deeply, Diane. I'm devastated that my marriage is ending. And yes, I'm angry about the betrayal. But emotional outbursts won't change the situation or improve my position. No, she agreed. But they're human. Perhaps I'll indulge in one after the papers are signed, I said with a small smile. For now, I need clarity. She nodded, gathering her notes. We'll file first thing Monday morning. In the meantime, document everything. If Robert removes items from the house, take photos. If he contacts you directly, save the messages but don't respond. And Miranda? Yes? Try to get some sleep. This is a marathon, not a sprint. As I left her office, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was Marcus. Package delivered to Victoria Chen. She was very interested in the contents. Also, Robert. Called the office looking for you twice. Didn't leave a message. I texted back, thank you. Phase 1 initiated. Keep monitoring the Saxon and Reed accounts. Driving home, I realized I'd need to find somewhere else to stay for the weekend while Robert moved his things. The thought of returning to an empty house, one that had once been filled with our shared life, felt suddenly overwhelming. For the first time since Robert's announcement, I felt tears threatening. I pulled into a parking lot and allowed myself 5 minutes, precisely 5 minutes by the dashboard clock, to feel the full weight of what was happening. 15 years of marriage, ending not with a mutual decision or a gradual growing apart, but with a betrayal so cliched it was almost insulting. When the timer on my phone chimed, I dried my eyes, reapplied my lipstick using the rearview mirror, and continued driving. Not home, but to the Four Seasons downtown. If Robert was going to spend the weekend dismantling our life together, I would spend it being pampered in a luxury suite with room service and a spa appointment. And on Monday morning, when the divorce papers were filed, Phase 2 of my plan would begin, the phase where Robert Saxon would start to understand exactly what he had lost. The Four Seasons presidential suite offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, the same skyline visible from my office at Emerson, Financial. From this height, people looked like miniature figures moving along predetermined paths. I wondered if Robert felt the same way watching them, not realizing he too was moving along a path I had quietly laid out for him. My phone chimed, with a text from Marcus. Diane filed the papers this morning. Robert has been served. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I sipped my coffee and watched the city wake up. 3 days at the Four Seasons had given me clarity and distance, exactly what I needed before the next phase began. When I finally replied to Marcus, it was just 2 words: proceed accordingly. He would understand. We had planned this meticulously over the past 3 weeks. Phase 2 would begin with subtle changes to the financial structure supporting Saxon and Reed. Nothing dramatic, just enough to create questions Robert couldn't easily answer. My phone rang. Robert. Miranda, he began without preamble when I answered. This is absurd. According to these papers, you're claiming the house, both vacation properties, full ownership of your company, and half of our joint accounts. What exactly am I supposed to get after 15 years of marriage? Exactly what the prenuptial agreement stipulates, I replied calmly. The agreement your firm drafted, if you recall. That was 15 years ago, before I helped build your client list, before I supported your career expansion, before you decided Brooke was worth throwing away our marriage? I interrupted, surprising myself with the edge in my voice. You're welcome to contest. The prenup, Robert. Diane can provide the relevant contact information for that process. There was a long pause. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted from indignation to calculation. I just want what's fair, Miranda. We both contributed to building our life together. Yes, we did. And now we're both experiencing the consequences of your decision to end that life together. I kept my voice neutral, factual. The prenup is clear. You're entitled to half of our joint accounts, the artwork and furniture we purchased together, and your personal belongings. Your retirement accounts remain yours, as mine remain mine. And what about the firm? My future there? This was the opening I'd been anticipating. What about it? Saxon and Reed predates our marriage. It has nothing to do with our divorce settlement. Another pause. My partnership was secured during our marriage. Your connections helped secure that partnership. There's a case to be made. By all means, make it, I said. Just be prepared for extensive discovery into exactly how your partnership was secured and who facilitated those connections. I could practically hear him weighing his options. Robert had always been pragmatic when it came to risk assessment. What do you really want, Miranda? He finally asked. I want exactly what I'm entitled to under the legal agreement we both signed, I replied. Nothing more, nothing less. This isn't like you, he said, a note of confusion entering his voice. You've always been reasonable, willing to negotiate. People change, Robert. something you've recently demonstrated quite thoroughly. After another strained silence, he sighed. Fine. I'll review everything with Thomas and get back to you through proper channels. As I hung up, I received another text from Marcus. Victoria Chen filed a motion regarding potential conflicts of interest in the Westfield case, specifically naming Brooks' undisclosed prior connection. A small smile played at my lips. Right on schedule. My phone rang again almost immediately. Robert, again. What did you do? He demanded without greeting. You'll need to be more specific, I replied, keeping my tone even. Victoria Chen just filed a motion questioning Brooks' involvement in the Westfield case, claiming she had an undisclosed prior connection to one of their subsidiaries. The managing partners are furious. That sounds like a Saxon and Reed problem, not a divorce issue, I observed. Perhaps you should discuss it with your firm's ethics committee. You know damn well Brooke mentioned that internship during her interview. You were at the firm dinner when she talked about it. Was I? I asked innocently. I recall many firm dinners with many conversations about many interns and paralegals. They tend to blur together after a while. This isn't a game, Miranda, he snapped. This could seriously damage Brooks' career. And mine, by association. Actions have consequences, Robert, I replied. Just as your decision to end our marriage has consequences. I suggest you focus on your legal response to the divorce filing. Everything else is peripheral. After hanging up, I gazed back at the city skyline. Robert still didn't understand what was happening, that every foundation he believed was solid had actually been built on invisible supports I had strategically placed over the years. Supports I was now quietly removing, one by one. 2 days. Later, I returned to my house. Not our house, my house, to find it largely unchanged except for the conspicuous gaps where Robert's belongings had been. His books missing from the shelves, his ridiculous collection of law school memorabilia gone from the study, his clothes no longer hanging in the master closet. What surprised me was how little it affected the overall feel of the space. Robert had lived here for 15 years, yet his absence felt like a minor adjustment rather than a gaping void. I was hanging my coat when the doorbell rang. Opening it revealed Caroline, Robert's law partner's wife, holding a bottle of expensive champagne and wearing an expression of practiced sympathy. I heard, she said simply. News travels fast, I replied, stepping aside to let her in. Divorce is like a forest fire in our social circle, she said, following me to the kitchen. Everyone watches to see which way the wind blows, terrified. It might spread to their own carefully constructed lives. I smiled despite myself. Caroline had always been more perceptive than her husband gave her credit for. I assume you've been nominated as the reconnaissance team? I asked, retrieving 2 champagne flutes from the cabinet. She laughed. Guilty, though I volunteered for the role. Better me than Judith Pierce with her religious platitudes or Samantha Davis with her not-so-subtle probing about alimony figures. As we settled in the living room with our champagne, Caroline studied me carefully. You seem remarkably composed for someone whose husband just left them for his 20-something paralegal. What would you prefer? That I weep into my pillowcase or cut up his suits? It would be the expected response, she admitted. This calm calculation is unnerving. I sipped my champagne, considering how much to reveal. Caroline wasn't just a social acquaintance. She was married to William Reed, the founding partner's son and current managing partner of Saxon and Reed. I'm processing the situation in my own way, I said carefully. By filing for divorce 3 days after he moved out, claiming everything of value, and somehow triggering an ethics investigation that has the entire firm in an uproar? She raised an eyebrow. That's quite the processing technique. The ethics investigation has nothing to do with me, I replied truthfully. The envelope I'd sent to Victoria Chen had contained only public information. How she used it was entirely her decision. Perhaps, Caroline conceded. But it's remarkably convenient timing, wouldn't you say? I met her gaze directly. What exactly— Did William send you here to ask, Caroline? She set down her glass. William doesn't know I'm here. In fact, he expressly forbade anyone at the firm from contacting you directly. This was interesting. Why? Because the firm's financial controller reported some concerning patterns in their operating accounts yesterday. Specifically, delayed disbursements from their primary real estate investment partners. She watched me closely. The same partners, who began investing shortly after you and Robert married. So they had made the connection faster than I anticipated. Impressive. That sounds like a firm management issue, I said neutrally. I'm not sure what it has to do with our divorce. Miranda, Caroline said softly, we've known each other for 15 years. I was there when you built Emerson Financial from a boutique advisory into a powerhouse. I've watched you orchestrate financial strategies that made millions for your clients. Do you really expect me to believe you're not behind whatever is happening at Saxon and Reed right now? I considered my response carefully. Caroline wasn't my enemy, but she wasn't exactly my ally either. What I expect, I said finally, is that everyone will focus on their own interests during this transition period. Robert is focused on his new relationship and maintaining his partnership. I'm focused on protecting what I've built. And you, I added, meeting her gaze directly, are focused on ensuring whatever happens doesn't impact William's position at the firm. She didn't deny it. Will it? That depends entirely on how the firm responds to the current situation, I replied. Some partners might question why Robert was allowed to pursue a relationship with a subordinate that now threatens a major case. Others might wonder why the firm's financial controllers didn't establish more diverse funding sources. Caroline nodded slowly, understanding the unspoken message. And if these questions lead to a leadership change? Then I imagine the firm will adapt, as successful organizations do. I refilled our glasses. William has always been the more capable partner. Perhaps this is his opportunity to demonstrate that. A small smile played at Caroline's lips. I've always liked you, Miranda, even when the other wives found you intimidating or standoffish. And I've always appreciated your discretion, I replied, which is why I trust this conversation will remain between us. Of course, she raised her glass. To new beginnings. As we clinked glasses, my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Phase 2 complete. Saxon and Reed operating account disbursement. Delayed another week. Partners meeting called for tomorrow morning. I smiled, taking another sip of champagne. The pieces were moving exactly as planned. Soon, Robert would begin to understand just what he had walked away from, and who had been quietly supporting his success all along. The real revelation was still to come. The partners meeting at Saxon and Reed must have been eventful, judging by the flurry of texts I received from various sources throughout the morning. Marcus forwarded updates from his contact in their accounting department. Emergency financial review underway. William Reed personally examining all investment sources. My phone rang shortly after noon. Diane Levinson. Your soon-to-be ex-husband's attorney just called, she said without preamble. They want to schedule a settlement conference as soon as possible. That was fast, I noted, reviewing quarterly projections on my laptop. What changed? Apparently, Robert is now willing to accept the prenuptial terms without contest. They're asking for a few minor adjustments, the art collection from your Aspen property and his mother's silverware. I considered this. The silverware had been a wedding gift from his mother, who had passed away 3 years ago. The art in Aspen was primarily pieces we had selected together during our travels. He can have the silverware, I decided. The art stays with the property. Are you sure? That's an easy concession that might smooth things along. The art was purchased specifically for that space and complements the property value, I explained. If he wants individual pieces that have personal meaning, he can specify which ones. Diane made a note. What about the expedited timeline? They want to meet tomorrow. That works for me, I replied. The sooner this is resolved, the better. After hanging up, I stared thoughtfully at my computer screen. Robert's sudden willingness to accept the prenup terms suggested something had shifted dramatically. Likely the firm's financial review had revealed more than he anticipated. I pulled up a secure messaging system and contacted Thomas Chen, Victoria's brother and my quiet informant at Saxon & Reed's primary bank. Robert Saxon accessed line of credit. Information this morning. Attempted to increase personal drawing rights. Request flagged for review per your previous arrangement. Interesting. Robert was seeking liquidity, which suggested financial pressure beyond the divorce settlement. I thanked Thomas and closed the secure channel. My intercom buzzed. Ms. Emerson, there's a William Reed here to see you. No appointment. This was unexpected. William rarely left the comfortable confines of Saxon & Reed's offices, preferring to summon others to him. Send him in, I instructed, quickly closing sensitive files on my computer. William Reed entered my office with the confident stride of someone accustomed to commanding attention. At 58, he remained impressively fit, his silver hair, adding gravitas to his appearance. He'd always reminded me of a television casting director's idea of a distinguished attorney. Miranda, he greeted, extending his hand. Thank you for seeing me without an appointment. I shook his hand briefly. William, this is unexpected. Desperate times, he replied with a thin smile, taking a seat across from me. I assume you know why I'm here? I can hazard a guess, but I'd prefer you state your purpose directly. He studied me for a moment. You always were refreshingly straightforward. It's one of the qualities Robert mentioned when you first started. Dating. The reference to our early relationship felt like a calculated move, reminding me of happier times before discussing business. William, I said, glancing pointedly at my watch. I have a client call in 15 minutes. He nodded, abandoning the small talk. Our firm is experiencing some unexpected financial disruptions. Specifically, delayed disbursements from several real estate investment trusts that comprise a significant portion of our operating capital. I see, I replied neutrally. And you're telling me this because after a thorough review of these investment entities, we've discovered a rather intricate ownership structure that eventually traces back to shell companies remarkably, similar to those used by Emerson Financial for certain client investments. So they had connected the dots faster than I anticipated. I kept my expression neutral. That's quite the investigation you've conducted, I observed, though I'm still not clear why you're bringing this to me rather than your financial controllers. William leaned forward. Miranda, we both know you're behind these investment entities. What I don't understand is why you're suddenly restricting the capital flow to a firm where your husband is a partner. Ex-husband, I corrected. Or soon to be. And any investment entities I might control operate independently based on market conditions and risk assessments. These risk assessments conveniently changed the day after Robert moved out, he noted dryly. I allowed myself a small smile. Market timing can be unpredictable. William sighed, dropping the pretense. What do you want, Miranda? If this is about punishing Robert, there are less destructive ways to do it. The firm employs over 200 people. I'm well aware, I replied. Many of them women who've faced systematic barriers to advancement while men like Robert fast-tracked their careers through personal connections rather than merit. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. We've been working to address those issues. Have you? Because from what I understand, Brooks' meteoric rise from intern to handling aspects of the Westfield case bypassed several more qualified candidates. That was Robert's decision, not firm policy, he countered. A decision you, as managing partner, approved, I pointed out. William's expression hardened. Are you suggesting you're restricting our operating capital as some form of social justice? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm simply pointing out that investment entities make decisions based on their assessment of an organization's stability and leadership. Recent events at Saxon and Reed might reasonably cause concern about both. He studied me carefully. What would alleviate these concerns? This was the opening I'd been waiting for. A demonstrated commitment to organizational change. Perhaps starting with a leadership review of partners whose personal decisions have created ethical conflicts for the firm. You want Robert removed from the partnership, he said flatly. I didn't say that, I replied. But if investment entities were to see decisive action addressing problematic leadership, it might restore confidence in the firm's long-term stability. William was silent for a long moment. You realize you're essentially leveraging financial pressure to force a personnel decision. I'm explaining how investment decisions are made, I corrected. What Saxon and Reed does with that information is entirely up to its leadership. He stood, buttoning his suit jacket. I'll take your perspective under advisement. That's all anyone can ask, I replied, rising as well. Oh, and William? I understand the partners have granted Robert a substantial draw against future profits to secure a new residence. Given the firm's current financial situation, that seems remarkably generous. The flash of surprise in his eyes confirmed my information was accurate. Financial matters of the partnership are confidential. Of course, I agreed. Just as investment decisions of private entities are confidential, we all have our professional boundaries. After William left, I messaged Marcus. Meeting with William Reed just concluded. Accelerate Phase 3. They're moving faster than anticipated. His response was immediate. Already underway. Documentation prepared for Singapore entity transfer. Will restrict remaining capital flow by end of week. Phase 3 would effectively freeze the remaining investment capital flowing to Saxon and Reed, creating a crisis that would force immediate action. It was aggressive, perhaps even ruthless, but necessary to achieve the outcome I needed. My phone rang again. Robert. Whatever you're doing, stop it, he demanded without greeting. William just called an emergency partner meeting for tomorrow morning. Hello to you too, Robert, I replied. Calmly, I'm not doing anything that concerns you. Don't play innocent, Miranda. The firm's financial controller has identified several key investors suddenly restricting capital. Investors with suspicious connections to your client's structures. That sounds like a Saxon and Reed problem, not a divorce issue, I echoed my earlier response. This is beyond petty, even for... He stopped abruptly. Wait, did you orchestrate the Westfield ethics complaint too? I have no control over Victoria Chen's legal strategy, I replied truthfully. But you gave her the information, he pressed. You knew about Brooke's internship. You were the one who recommended her for it 3 years ago. I had forgotten that detail. It was before Brooke had caught Robert's eye, when she was just another promising law student I'd helped place through my network. 3 years ago, I helped many promising students secure internships, I said. I couldn't possibly remember everyone. This isn't just about the divorce, is it? Robert's voice had shifted from anger to realization. You're systematically dismantling everything around me. That's rather dramatic, don't you think? I kept my tone light. I'm simply protecting my interests while you focus on your new beginning with Brooke. There was a long silence before he spoke again. The partners are questioning my judgment. Some are suggesting I take a leave of absence until the Westfield matter is resolved. That sounds prudent, I agreed. It would give you more time to focus on your new relationship. Damn it, Miranda! His composure finally broke. You know what this means for my career, for my future. Actions have consequences, Robert, I reminded him softly. You made your choice. Now you're experiencing the results of that choice. After he hung up, I sat quietly, processing the conversation. Part of me felt a profound sadness for what we had lost, not just our marriage, but the respect and partnership we had once shared. Another part felt the quiet satisfaction of a strategy unfolding exactly as planned. Tomorrow would bring the partner meeting where Robert's future at the firm would be decided. Whatever the outcome, he would begin to understand that his professional success had never been solely of his own making, and that the wife he so casually discarded had been the invisible architect of much of what he took for granted. The real revelation was still to come. The settlement conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. at Diane Levinson's office, neutral territory that somehow still felt like home field advantage. I arrived 15 minutes early to review strategy with Diane. Robert's attorney submitted their final proposal last night, she said, sliding a document across the table. They've conceded on all major points. Robert gets his mother's silverware, his personal effects, and half the joint accounts as stipulated. In the prenup, he's requesting 4 specific art pieces from the Aspen property, all gifts he gave you over the years. I scanned the list. A small Morisot watercolor he'd given me for our 10th anniversary. A sculpture from a local Aspen artist commemorating our first ski trip there. 2 abstract pieces we'd selected together in Barcelona. He can have them, I decided. They were the only items with genuine sentimental value he'd requested. Perhaps there was still a sliver of the Robert I'd married somewhere beneath the midlife crisis cliché he'd become. Are you sure? Diane asked. The Morisot alone is appraised at— I'm sure, I interrupted. Some things aren't about monetary value. Diane studied me for a moment. You're not what I expected when you first walked into my office, Miranda. Most clients in your position would be fighting for every penny. This was never about money, I reminded her. It's about consequences and recognition. Before she could respond, her assistant announced that Robert and his attorney had arrived. The next hour proceeded with the clinical efficiency of dissolving a business partnership, which in many ways was exactly what our marriage had become. Assets divided, paperwork signed, futures officially separated. Robert was subdued throughout, none of his usual courtroom confidence evident in his demeanor. When his attorney stepped out to make a call, he finally spoke directly to me. I hear the partner meeting went well for you this morning. I raised an eyebrow. I wasn't present at your firm's partner meeting. You didn't need to be, he replied with a bitter smile. Your presence was felt quite thoroughly. William presented a detailed analysis of the firm's investment structure, including the rather stunning revelation that nearly 30% of our operating capital traces back to entities you control. So William had laid it all out for the partners. Bold move. Financial structures can be complicated, I offered noncommittally. Don't, Robert said sharply. At least give me the dignity of acknowledging what you've done. I considered him for a moment. And what exactly have I done, Robert? You've systematically undermined my position at the firm while simultaneously cutting off my financial resources. His voice was low, controlled. The partners have voted to place me on a 6-month leave of absence. The ethics complaint regarding Brooke has triggered a full review of the Westfield case, which will likely be reassigned. And the firm's operating account is suddenly experiencing technical delays that have frozen partner distributions. That sounds like a challenging situation, I acknowledged. It's financial and professional sabotage, he countered. And we both know it. I leaned forward slightly. What we both know, Robert, is that actions have consequences. You chose to end our marriage for a younger woman. That was your right. But you don't get to dictate how I restructure my investments afterward. This goes beyond investment restructuring, he argued. You're deliberately trying to destroy me. If I wanted to destroy you, I said quietly, you wouldn't be sitting here negotiating favorable art selections. You'd be facing a contested divorce, a partnership expulsion, and potential ethical violations charges. What you're experiencing now is simply the removal of the invisible support system you never acknowledged. His brow furrowed. What are you talking about? Before I could respond, his attorney returned, and the moment passed. We completed the settlement signing with professional courtesy. As Robert stood to leave, I noticed the new creases in his suit, slightly lower quality than his usual attire, and the absence of his Rolex, replaced by a more modest timepiece. "Robert," I called as he reached the door, "you forgot your copy of the art inventory from Aspen. You'll need it for the removal service." He turned back, his expression unreadable as he took the folder. "Thank you." After he left, Diane turned to me. "You mentioned invisible support systems. Care to elaborate?" "Robert has always believed his success was entirely self-made," I explained. "He never understood that I was quietly creating opportunities and removing obstacles throughout our marriage. Not just the firm investments, but client introductions, strategic connections, even the coincidental meetings with influential people who later became his clients." "And now you've stopped," she observed. "Not stopped," I corrected. "Just become visible as the source. The difference is significant." Marcus was waiting in my office when I returned. "Congratulations on finalizing the divorce," he said, rising to greet me. "How does it feel to be officially single again?" "Ask me in a few months," I replied, setting down my briefcase. "What's the status on Phase 3? "Fully implemented as of this morning. The Singapore entity has formally notified Saxon & Reed of a complete investment review pending resolution, of governance concerns. All capital disbursements are paused for minimum 30 days. I nodded, processing this information. "And their reaction?" "Exactly as expected. Emergency partnership meeting this morning. William Reed has taken direct control of all financial operations. Robert has been placed on administrative leave and—" He paused, checking his tablet. "Thomas Chen reports that Robert's line of credit request was officially denied an hour ago." "Perfect timing," I noted. "They'll connect it to the partnership decision rather than our arrangement." "There's something else," Marcus added, his expression turning serious. "Brooke Reynolds submitted her resignation from Saxon & Reed this morning. Apparently, the ethics review made her position untenable. This was unexpected. I'd intended to pressure Robert, not destroy Brooke's career. She was young, ambitious, and misguided in her personal choices, but she was also talented. "Where is she going?" I asked. "Unknown," Marcus replied, "though there's a rumor she's been offered a position at Harrington and Walsh in their corporate division. Lower profile, but solid experience. Harrington and Walsh was a respectable mid-tier firm, coincidentally one where I had several investment connections. I made a mental note to ensure those connections remained healthy." "Good," I said simply. "She deserves a fresh start away from Robert's influence." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "That's surprisingly generous, considering the circumstances." "This was never about punishing Brooke," I explained. "She's a symptom, not the cause. Robert is the one who broke our vows, betrayed our trust, and needs to understand the consequences of his choices." "Speaking of consequences," Marcus said, checking his watch, "the Cayman Holdings transfer completes at midnight. Once that happens, the paper trail connecting you to the Saxon & Reed investments becomes virtually impossible to trace without specific foreknowledge." "And Robert's personal finances?" Marcus pulled up a detailed report on his tablet. "With partner distributions frozen and his line of credit denied, he's facing imminent liquidity issues. The down payment on his new condo consumed most of his accessible cash. Without the expected partner draw, he'll struggle to maintain his current lifestyle beyond 60 days. I nodded, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Part of me, the hurt, betrayed wife, felt vindicated by his financial distress. Another part, the strategic businesswoman, recognized that I needed to establish clear boundaries for this intervention. Implement the contingency trigger, I decided. If his accounts drop below the threshold we established, the emergency line of credit activates, anonymously, through the Hong Kong entity. Enough to prevent complete financial ruin, but not enough to maintain his lifestyle with Brooke. Marcus made a note. Setting financial floor but not ceiling. Understood. This isn't about destroying him, I clarified. It's about revealing the truth. And what truth is that? Marcus asked, studying me curiously. That his success was never solely his own achievement. That the wife he discarded was integral to building the life he took for granted. And that choices have consequences beyond the immediate gratification they provide. My phone buzzed with a text from Diane. Robert's attorney just called. He wants to schedule a follow-up meeting to discuss recently discovered financial matters. Advice? I showed the message to Marcus, who smiled. Phase 4 already? Apparently so, I replied, typing my response to Diane. Schedule for next week. Let's see how uncomfortable things get for him first. As Marcus left to implement the contingency trigger, I turned to the window, gazing out at the city skyline. In one of those gleaming buildings, Robert was likely discovering that his administrative leave came with restricted access to firm resources. In another, Brooke was probably packing her office, wondering if her relationship with Robert was worth the professional setback. And here I stood, finally visible as the architect of both their situations. The revelation had begun, but it wasn't complete. Robert still didn't fully understand the extent of my influence over his professional success, or how dependent his new beginning with Brooke would be on my continued forbearance. That understanding would come next week, when I finally revealed the full scope of what he had walked away from when he decided our marriage was disposable. For now, I had a company to run and investments to manage, including the ones that would determine whether Saxon and Reed could weather the storm I had engineered. The week passed with the structured precision that had always characterized my professional life. Quarterly reviews completed, client portfolios adjusted, investment strategies refined. To anyone observing from the outside, it would appear that my divorce had caused barely a ripple in the smooth operation of my life and business. Appearances, as I well knew, could be deceiving. Each night, I returned to an empty house that still held echoes of a 15-year marriage. A marriage I had believed was built on mutual respect and shared ambition, only to discover it had morphed into something else when I wasn't looking. Or perhaps I had been looking, but chose not to see. The Hong Kong trigger activated last night. Marcus reported during our morning briefing. Robert's primary account dropped below the threshold. The emergency line of credit is now available to him, though he doesn't know the source. I nodded, sipping my coffee. Has he accessed it yet? No. But his mortgage payment is due tomorrow, so I expect he will soon. I considered this information. And Brooke? Started at Harrington and Walsh yesterday. Junior associate position with the corporate team. 40% salary reduction from her paralegal compensation at Saxon and Reed. That would be a difficult adjustment for someone who had grown accustomed to the lifestyle Robert provided. Expensive dinners, weekend getaways, the promise of a comfortable future secured by his partnership status. Have you confirmed the meeting with Robert for tomorrow? I asked. Yes. His attorney wanted it at their offices, but Diane insisted on neutral territory. They settled on the conference room at First National Bank downtown. 2:00. I made a note in my calendar. And the documentation for the meeting? Marcus handed me a secure tablet. Everything you requested. Full disclosure of all investment entities connected to Saxon and Reed, documentation of capital flow over the past 10 years, and the parallel timeline of Robert's career advancement alongside your financial support. I reviewed the materials, noting the meticulous detail. Anyone examining this documentation would see the unmistakable pattern. Each significant step in Robert's career coincided with strategic investment or connection facilitated by one of my entities. This is excellent work, Marcus. He nodded, but hesitated before speaking again. Miranda, are you sure about this approach? Full disclosure means burning bridges that can never be rebuilt. I considered his question carefully. Some bridges should remain ashes. And the collateral damage to Saxon and Reed? To the other partners who weren't involved in Robert's personal decisions? This had been weighing on me as well. My issue was with Robert, not the entire firm. William Reed had built a reputable practice that employed hundreds of people, many of whom had nothing to do with the toxic culture that had fostered Robert's behavior. I've decided to modify Phase 4, I told him. We'll proceed with the personal revelation to Robert, but we'll also offer Saxon and Reed a path to financial stability, contingent on their implementation of specific governance reforms. Reform conditions in exchange for resumed investment? Marcus clarified. Precisely. William Reed is a pragmatist. He'll recognize the value proposition. Marcus made notes on his tablet. I'll prepare the appropriate documentation. After he left, I turned my attention to the quarterly client reports, but found my mind drifting to tomorrow's meeting. What would Robert's reaction be when he finally understood the full scope of what he had discarded? Would he feel remorse? Anger? Or would he simply calculate his next move, as he had always done when faced with unpleasant realities? My phone buzzed with a text from Caroline. Heard you're meeting with Robert tomorrow. William is nervous about what this means for the firm. Any hints you can share? I smiled at her directness. Caroline had always been the most politically astute of the partners' wives, understanding power dynamics better than most of the attorneys. Tell William his concerns about the firm are being considered separately from Robert's situation. We'll discuss after tomorrow's meeting. Her response was immediate. Understood. Dinner next week? Just us girls. I accepted the invitation, recognizing it for what it was, an intelligence-gathering operation wrapped in social niceties. But Caroline's friendship, however strategic, was one of the few connections from my married life that I valued enough to maintain. The rest of the day passed in a blur of client calls and investment reviews. That evening, as I prepared for the next day's confrontation, my doorbell rang unexpectedly. Through the security camera, I saw Brooke standing on my doorstep, nervously shifting her weight from one designer heel to another. This was the last person I expected to find at my door. After a moment's hesitation, I opened it. Mrs. Saxon, Ms. Emerson, she stammered. I know this is incredibly inappropriate, but I need to speak with you. She looked different from the confident paralegal who had laughed at Robert's jokes at firm dinners. The expensive highlights in her honey blonde hair were growing out, her designer dress appeared to be from last season, and the confidence that had once radiated from her had dimmed considerably. This is certainly unexpected, I acknowledged, studying her carefully. Why are you here, Brooke? May I come in? Just for a few minutes, she added hastily. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. Against my better judgment, I stepped aside to let her enter. I led her to the living room, gesturing for her to sit while I remained standing. I'll be direct, she said, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. Robert doesn't know I'm here. He would be furious if he found out. That makes two of us with something in common, I remarked dryly. She winced but continued. Something's happening with Saxon and Reed's finances. Robert's partner distributions have stopped completely. The down payment on his condo used most of his liquid assets. His credit cards were declined yesterday. She looked up at me. He thinks you're behind it. Why would you come to me with this? Because I need to understand what's happening, she said, a note of desperation entering her voice. 1 minute, I was a rising star at a prestigious firm with a successful partner who promised me everything. Now I'm starting over at a second-tier firm while watching Robert spiral into financial panic. None of it makes sense. I studied her for a moment. What exactly did Robert tell you about his financial situation when you began your relationship? She shifted uncomfortably. That he was a full equity partner at Saxon and Reed, that he had substantial investments and savings, that he could provide the kind of life I dreamed of. And you never verified any of this? Why would I? She asked, genuinely confused. He drove a Tesla, wore Rolex watches, took me to 5-star restaurants. Everything confirmed what he told me. I felt a surprising twinge of sympathy for her. Brooke wasn't the villain in this story, just another person who had accepted Robert's carefully constructed facade without questioning what lay beneath. Robert presented himself to you the same way he presented himself to the world, I explained, as a self-made success story who built his career through talent and hard work. The reality is more complicated. What do you mean? Robert's success was largely facilitated by connections and investments I provided throughout our marriage, I said simply. Connections and investments he never acknowledged or perhaps even recognized. Her expression shifted from confusion to dawning comprehension. The firm's financial troubles? That's you withdrawing support? I'm restructuring investments that were always mine to control, I corrected. Robert's current situation is simply the natural consequence of that restructuring. But why now? Why not when you first separated? Because consequences should be educational, not merely punitive, I replied. Robert needed to understand exactly what he was losing when he decided our marriage was disposable. Brooke was silent, for a long moment, processing this information. So what happens now? Do you destroy his career completely? Bankrupt him? Force him to start over at 45? The genuine concern in her voice was surprising. Perhaps there was more to her feelings for Robert than I had assumed. That depends largely on Robert, I said truthfully. I have no interest in destroying him. I simply want him to recognize the reality of his situation and make informed choices moving forward. Including about me? She asked perceptively. Your relationship with Robert is your business, I replied. But you deserve to make that choice with full awareness of who he is and what he can actually provide. She nodded slowly, then stood to leave. Thank you for being honest with me. It's more than Robert has been. As she reached the door, I called after her. Brooke, your position at Harrington and Walsh, it's a good firm with solid leadership. Don't let Robert's problems derail your own career. You have talent. She looked back, surprised by the unexpected encouragement. Thank you. After she left, I poured myself a glass of wine and considered the encounter. Brooke's visit had humanized her in a way I hadn't anticipated. She wasn't just the younger woman who had attracted my husband's wandering attention. She was someone who had made poor choices based on incomplete information. Much like I had 15 years ago, when I married Robert believing we shared the same values and vision for the future. Tomorrow's meeting would change everything. For Robert, for Saxon and Reed, and perhaps for Brooke as well. The final revelation was coming, and with it, the opportunity for everyone involved to make more informed choices about their futures, including Meet at First National Bank's executive conference room exuded old money confidence, oak paneling, leather chairs, and discreet art that likely cost more than most people's homes. I arrived 15 minutes early, as was my habit for important meetings, with Marcus and Diane flanking me like well-dressed sentinels. Everything is prepared, Marcus confirmed, setting up his laptop. The presentation is loaded. Secure documentation. Is ready for distribution. Diane arranged her legal papers with practiced precision. Remember, this isn't a legal proceeding. It's an information session. If Robert or his attorney attempt to turn this into a negotiation, we end the meeting. I nodded, reviewing my own notes one final time. This meeting wasn't about legal strategies or financial leverage. It was about truth. The truth Robert had, never acknowledged, perhaps never even recognized, about the foundation of his success. At exactly 2:00, Robert arrived with his attorney, Thomas Beck, a senior partner at Saxon and Reed and one of the firm's founding members. The selection was strategic, signaling that this was about the firm as much as Robert's personal situation. Miranda, Thomas greeted me with professional courtesy. We had known each other for 15 years. serving on charitable boards together, and navigating the same social circles. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. Of course, I replied, shaking his hand before turning to Robert. Robert. My soon-to-be ex-husband looked markedly different from the confident attorney who had announced his intention to leave me just weeks ago. His suit, while still well-tailored, wasn't his usual bespoke Italian. His complexion had the slightly gray tinge of someone not sleeping well, and the confident smile he typically wore in professional settings had been replaced by a guarded expression. Miranda, he acknowledged tersely. Once everyone was seated, Thomas took the lead. We've requested this meeting to discuss certain financial matters that have come to light since your divorce proceedings began, specifically, the apparent connection between your investment entities and Saxon and Reed's operating capital. Yes, I replied simply. I assumed that was the purpose. Thomas glanced at Robert before continuing. While these matters weren't disclosed, during the divorce settlement, they significantly impact Robert's financial position and professional standing. We believe there may be grounds for reopening the settlement discussion. Diane immediately leaned forward. The divorce is finalized, Mr. Beck. My client fully disclosed all assets required under the prenuptial agreement. Mr. Saxon signed off on those disclosures willingly. The disclosures didn't include Ms. Emerson's substantial control over Saxon and Reed's financial structure, Thomas countered. A structure that directly impacts Mr. Saxon's partnership value and income potential. That's because my investment entities are entirely separate from my personal assets, I interjected calmly. They weren't subject to division under the prenuptial agreement, as I believe your firm's own legal department confirmed during settlement discussions. Thomas cleared his throat. Technically correct, but there's an argument to be made about disclosure obligations when those investments so directly impact a spouse's livelihood. An argument that would be both circular and self-defeating, Diane replied. Since you'd be arguing that Mr. Saxon should have been aware of investment entities that significantly benefited his career, entities he now claims were hidden from him. Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but Robert cut him off. Enough legal maneuvering, he said sharply. Miranda, what exactly are you doing? This isn't just about punishing me anymore. You're threatening the financial stability of an entire law firm where 200 people work. I studied him for a moment. Is that what you think this is about? Punishment? What else would you call systematically dismantling the financial foundations of my career immediately after our divorce? I'd call it consequence education, I replied. And to be clear, I'm not dismantling anything. I'm simply making visible what was previously invisible. What does that even mean? He demanded, frustration evident in his voice. I nodded to Marcus, who activated the presentation on the large screen at the end of the table. The first slide displayed a timeline. Robert's career milestones on one axis, my investment activities on the parallel axis. Robert, for 15 years you've operated under the belief that your success was entirely self-made, I began. Your talent, your hard work, your networking skills, and you do possess all of those qualities. But there has been another factor, at work that you've never acknowledged or perhaps even recognized. Marcus advanced to the next slide, showing the complex structure of investment entities I had established over the years. These are the financial entities I control, I explained. Notice the dates of formation and initial investment in Saxon and Reed properties and operations. Each one corresponds precisely with a major advancement in your career. Robert leaned forward, studying the diagram with growing disbelief. That's impossible. The Wellington Street property acquisition was pure luck. The owner approached the firm directly with the opportunity. The owner approached after receiving a very generous offer from one of my Singapore entities. I corrected, an offer strategically designed to be just appealing enough to make them consider selling, but not so appealing that they would accept immediately. The introduction to Saxon and Reed was carefully orchestrated through 3 separate channels to appear coincidental. Robert's face paled as Marcus advanced through more slides, each revealing another seemingly fortuitous career development that had actually been carefully engineered through my network of connections and investment vehicles. The Harrison merger, the Peterson client acquisition, the judicial appointment that opened the senior partner position? Robert's voice grew increasingly strained. You're claiming responsibility for all of it? Not responsibility, I clarified. Facilitation. You still had to perform, Robert. You still had to win cases and impress clients. I simply ensured you had the opportunities to do so at precisely the right moments in your career. Thomas Beck sat in stunned silence, his legal pad untouched as he processed the implications for the firm he had helped build. Why? Robert finally asked. Why go to such elaborate lengths without ever telling me? It was the question I had anticipated, yet the answer was more complex than I could fully articulate in this setting. Initially, it was because I believed in you, I said honestly. I saw your potential and wanted to help you achieve it. Later, it became habit, a way to contribute to our partnership when you seemed increasingly uninterested in my direct input. About your career. And now? He asked quietly. Why reveal all this now? Because you made a choice based on incomplete information, I replied. You decided our marriage was disposable without understanding what you were actually walking away from. Not just a wife, but a strategic partner who had been instrumental in building the success you took full credit for. Robert ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of agitation I recognized from our marriage. So this is all about making me regret leaving you. No, I said firmly. It's about truth. You're free to leave our marriage. That was always your choice, to make. But you should make that choice with full awareness of the consequences. These consequences seem deliberately calculated to destroy my career, he argued. If I wanted to destroy your career, Robert, we wouldn't be having this conversation, I pointed out. I would have simply withdrawn all investment entities simultaneously, triggering a financial crisis at Saxon & Reed that would have left the firm with no options but bankruptcy or emergency acquisition. Thomas finally found his voice. And that's still your intention, Miranda? To withdraw all financial support from the firm? Marcus distributed folders to everyone present. This is our proposed restructuring plan for the continued investment relationship with Saxon & Reed, he explained. As you'll see, we're offering a path to stabilized funding contingent on specific governance reforms. Thomas opened the folder, quickly scanning the document. These conditions, they would require significant changes to the partnership structure. They would require the firm to address the systemic issues that allowed someone like Robert to advance while engaging in an inappropriate relationship with a subordinate, I corrected, including transparent ethics reviews, partnership accountability measures, and improved advancement pathways for qualified women and minorities. In other words, Robert said bitterly, you're using financial leverage to force social engineering at the firm. I'm using investment criteria to ensure my capital supports organizations aligned with my values, I countered. Something all investors have the right to do. Robert turned to Thomas. The firm can't possibly accept these terms. It would fundamentally change how we operate. Perhaps that's precisely what needs to happen, Thomas replied thoughtfully, surprising both Robert and me. The firm has evolved too slowly in certain areas. This wake-up call might be necessary. You can't be serious, Robert protested. I'm entirely serious, Thomas said firmly. Miranda has presented us with a choice between necessary evolution and potential financial crisis. As senior partner, my obligation is to protect the firm and its employees, not your ego. The meeting continued for another hour, with Thomas asking detailed questions about the restructuring proposal, while Robert grew increasingly withdrawn. When Thomas finally stood to leave, he extended his hand to me. Thank you for your transparency. Miranda, the executive committee will review this proposal immediately. I believe we can find a workable solution. After they departed, Diane turned to me with a raised eyebrow. That went differently than expected. I anticipated more resistance from Thomas. Thomas is a businessman first and foremost, I replied. He recognizes the value proposition, financial stability in exchange for governance reforms the firm should have implemented years ago. And Robert? Marcus asked. What happens to him now? I gathered my papers, considering the question. That depends entirely on Robert. The emergency credit line remains available to prevent financial catastrophe. His position at the firm is Thomas's decision. His relationship with Brooke is his own choice to make, now with full understanding of his actual circumstances. Do you think he'll try to reconcile with you? Diane asked bluntly. The question caught me off guard. In all my strategic planning, I hadn't given serious consideration to that possibility. Would Robert, faced with the reality of his situation, attempt to salvage our marriage? I don't know, I admitted. But if he does, it will be for the wrong reasons. As we left the conference room, I felt a strange sense of closure. The revelation was complete. Robert finally understood what he had walked away from. Not just a wife, but a strategic partner who had been the invisible architect of much of his success. Whatever happened next would be shaped by that understanding. And for the first time, since he had announced his intention to leave, I felt fully prepared to move forward, with or without Robert Saxon in my life. The aftermath of the revelation unfolded with a predictable sequence of reactions. First came silence, 3 days during which Robert made no attempt to contact me. Then came anger, expressed through a series of increasingly emotional text messages sent at 2 a.m, oscillating between accusations of betrayal and demands for explanation. Finally, on the 6th day after our meeting, came the inevitable request. We need to talk. Not through lawyers, just us. I considered ignoring it, but closure required completion. When and where? I replied. His response was immediate. Tonight. The bench in Riverside Park where we got engaged. The sentiment of the location wasn't lost. On me. Robert was attempting to establish an emotional connection, to remind me of our shared history. It was precisely the kind of calculated move I would have expected from him. PM, I agreed. For 30 minutes only. I arrived at the park deliberately, 5 minutes late, unwilling to give Robert the satisfaction of finding me waiting. The evening was cool, the river reflecting the city lights as joggers and dog walkers passed by, oblivious to the private drama unfolding on one particular bench. Robert was already there, staring out at the water. He'd lost weight in the weeks. Since moving out, his clothes hanging slightly looser on his frame, his face more angular than I remembered. He stood as I approached. Miranda, he said, his voice carrying a tension I recognized from difficult negotiations. Thank you for coming. I took a seat on the bench, maintaining a careful distance between us. You said we needed to talk. He sat beside me, his hands clasped together as if restraining himself from reaching toward me. I've been doing a lot of thinking since our meeting. About us. About everything you revealed. And? I prompted when he paused. And I realize I made a terrible mistake, he said, turning to face me directly. I threw away something precious without understanding its true value. The words were perfectly chosen, the delivery impeccable. Classic Robert Saxon in persuasion mode. I had witnessed this technique countless times during our marriage, usually deployed when he needed something from me. You're referring to my financial support of your career, I said flatly. He flinched. Not just that, our partnership, the foundation, we built together. He took a deep breath. I miss you, Miranda. Do you miss me, or do you miss the advantages I provided? I asked, genuinely curious about his answer. Both, he admitted with unexpected honesty. Is that so wrong? We had a good life together. I took it for granted, made a foolish mistake. But people deserve second chances. I studied him carefully. What about Brooke? He looked away, back toward the river. It's over. It wasn't what I thought it would be. Meaning, she wasn't who I thought she was once reality set in, he said, a note of bitterness entering his voice. Once the fantasy of starting fresh with someone new collided with the practical realities. Practical realities like your financial situation, I suggested. He had the grace to look ashamed. That's part of it. Things became strained when I couldn't maintain the lifestyle I'd promised her. But it was more than that. We didn't have the foundation, the history, the understanding that you and I built over 15 years. I allowed his words to settle between us, carried away by the evening breeze, like fallen leaves. There was truth in what he said. Relationships built primarily on physical attraction and fantasy rarely withstand the pressures of real life. But there was calculation too, evident in the careful way he framed his regret. What exactly are you proposing, Robert? I asked directly. He turned back to me, leaning slightly closer. A reconciliation, a fresh start. We could go to counseling, rebuild the trust. I know it wouldn't be easy, but what we had is worth fighting for. And what about your position at the firm? Would that be part of this reconciliation package? His expression flickered with momentary discomfort before he regained control. I won't pretend that's not a consideration. Thomas has made it clear that my future at Saxon & Reed depends largely on resolving the firm's financial situation, a situation connected to you. At least you're being honest about your motivations, I acknowledged. It's not just about the firm, he insisted. That's a factor, yes, but not the only one. These past weeks without you have been clarifying. I realized how much of my life was intertwined with yours, how much I depended on your steadiness, your perspective. I nodded slowly, processing his words. And if I were to agree to this reconciliation, what would be different? What would prevent you from seeking excitement with the next young associate who catches your eye when our marriage feels routine again? I've learned my lesson, he said earnestly. I understand now what I risked, what I almost threw away permanently. You did throw it away permanently, Robert, I corrected him. The divorce is final. Our marriage is over. Legally, perhaps, he countered. But we could start again. Date each other. Rebuild. I looked out at the river, at the path we had walked countless times during our marriage. This bench where he had proposed 15 years ago, promising a lifetime of partnership and loyalty. The same bench where he now sat offering a carefully calculated second chance that benefited him in multiple ways. You once told me that the greatest advantage a lawyer can have is the ability to recognize when a case is lost, I said quietly. To know when to settle, rather than continuing a fight that cannot be won. This isn't a legal negotiation, Miranda. This is our life. No, I said firmly. This is your attempt to recover what you lost without acknowledging why you lost it. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. What do you want me to say? That I made a terrible mistake? I've said that? That I regret hurting you? I do. Deeply. What else would convince you that I'm sincere? Nothing, I replied simply. Because this isn't about sincerity, Robert. It's about fundamental values. You didn't just have an affair. You systematically planned an exit from our marriage while maintaining a facade of commitment. That reveals something essential about your character that no apology can change. People make mistakes, he argued. 15 years counts for nothing? It counted for everything, I corrected him. That's why your betrayal was so profound. You didn't just cheat on me. You betrayed the partnership we built together. And you did it with the absolute confidence that you would suffer no significant consequences because you believed your success was entirely self-made. He was silent for a long moment. So there's no path forward for us? No possibility of redemption? There's A path forward for each of us separately, I said. Your reputation at the firm can be salvaged if you demonstrate genuine growth from this experience. Your financial situation will stabilize if you adjust to a more realistic lifestyle. But our marriage is over, Robert. Some things once broken cannot be repaired. And the firm? He asked, his tone shifting to resignation. Will you continue to withdraw your support? I've presented Thomas with a reasonable proposal for continued investment contingent on governance reforms. If the partnership accepts those terms, the firm will stabilize. Your position within it will depend on the value you provide going forward, without my invisible support. He nodded slowly, seeming to finally accept the finality of my decision. I really did love you, Miranda. Maybe not as well as you deserved, but I did. I believe you, I said softly. But love without respect and loyalty is ultimately meaningless. Sat in silence for a few minutes, watching the river flow past, each lost in private thoughts. Finally, I stood to leave. For what it's worth, I said. I hope you find your footing, Robert. Not for sentimental reasons, but because living well after loss is the ultimate victory. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable in the fading light. Is that what you're doing? Living well? I'm getting there, I replied honestly. One day at a time. As I walked away from the bench where our story had once begun, I felt a weightlifting, the final release of expectations and attachments that had lingered despite the signed divorce papers. Robert's attempt at reconciliation had been predictable, even expected, but my response had solidified something important within me. The next chapter of my life would be entirely my own creation, not defined by what I had lost, but by what I chose to build next. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Thomas Beck called. Executive Committee unanimously approved our proposal with minor adjustments, sending details now. Also, the Anderson acquisition is proceeding ahead of schedule. I smiled, quickening my pace toward the park exit. Business continued. Life moved forward. And for the first time since Robert had announced his intention to leave, I felt a genuine excitement about the possibilities that lay ahead. Possibilities entirely of my own making. 3 months passed with the steady rhythm of a life. Rebuilding itself, Emerson Financial continued to thrive, the Anderson acquisition exceeded projections, and my investment portfolio expanded into new territories I had previously avoided while mindful of potential conflicts with Robert's clients. The restructuring at Saxon and Reed progressed according to the terms we had negotiated. Thomas Beck proved to be surprisingly progressive once freed from the old guard's resistance to change. Weekly reports from Marcus confirmed that the firm was implementing the required governance reforms ahead of schedule. William Reed announced his transition to senior counsel status this morning, Marcus reported during our regular briefing. Effective immediately, the managing partner position will be filled by Eliza Harmon. I looked up from my laptop with interest. Eliza? That's unexpected. Is it? Marcus raised an eyebrow. She's been with the firm for 20 years, built their most profitable practice group, and has been pushing for diversity initiatives since before they were fashionable. Seems like a logical choice under the new governance structure. He was right? Eliza Harmon was exceptionally qualified, but had been repeatedly passed over for leadership roles during the old regime. Her elevation to managing partner signaled a genuine commitment to the reforms I had required. And Robert? I asked, maintaining a deliberately neutral tone. Marcus consulted his tablet. Still on administrative leave, though there are rumors. He may transition to an of-counsel position rather than returning as a full equity partner. I nodded, processing this information. It was a fair outcome, not career destruction, but a recalibration that reflected his actual value to the firm. Without my invisible support. The emergency credit line was accessed again yesterday, Marcus added. 7th time in 3 months. Balance is now at the maximum threshold we established. Keep it open, I decided, but no increases to the limit. The line of credit had been my one concession to sentiment, a financial safety net established through an anonymous Hong Kong entity that prevented Robert from complete financial ruin while still requiring him to significantly downsize his lifestyle. He would never know the source of this mysterious credit opportunity that had appeared just when his finances were most dire. Caroline called again, Marcus mentioned casually. 3rd time this week. She seems quite determined to schedule that. Dinner. I smiled despite myself. Caroline Reed's persistence was impressive. After her initial intelligence-gathering dinner invitation, she had continued to pursue a friendship that seemed increasingly genuine rather than strategic. I'll call her back, I promised. Things have been busy with the Singapore expansion. Miranda, Marcus said, his tone shifting to something more personal. When was the last time you did something that wasn't work-related? The question caught me off guard. I had dinner with the Andersons last week. That was a client meeting, he pointed out. I'm talking about something purely for yourself. A dinner with friends, a weekend away. Anything that doesn't involve quarterly projections or investment strategies. I couldn't immediately recall such an occasion. The past 3 months had been intensely focused on business, partly by necessity due to our expansion efforts, but also by choice. Work had always been my refuge during personal upheaval. I'm fine, Marcus, I assured him. Just focused. You're always focused, he agreed. But there's life beyond these walls, beyond the fallout from your divorce. His concern was touching, if misplaced. I'll call Caroline, I conceded. Schedule that dinner. Will that satisfy your sudden interest in my social calendar? He nodded, returning to business mode. The documentation for the Singapore entity. Transfer is complete. Final signatures needed by Friday. After our meeting concluded, I found myself standing at my office window, gazing at the city skyline as afternoon shadows lengthened across the urban landscape. Marcus's question lingered in my mind. When had I last done something purely for pleasure, disconnected from work or the strategic dismantling of Robert's illusions? My phone buzzed with a text from an unexpected source. Brooke Reynolds. I was just offered a junior partnership at Harrington and Walsh. Thought you should know. Thank you for what you said that night. It made a difference. I stared at the message, surprised by both its content and the fact that Brooke had reached out to me at all. Our last interaction had been that unexpected evening visit when she sought answers about Robert's financial situation. I hadn't expected to hear from her again. Congratulations. Well deserved, I'm sure. I replied after a moment's consideration. Her response came quickly. Would you have time for coffee sometime? There's something I'd like to discuss with you. Curiosity won out over caution. Tomorrow, 3 p.m. Davidson's on 5th. Davidson's was a quiet cafe tucked away from the main business district. Neutral territory where the likelihood of running into mutual acquaintances was minimal. I arrived precisely at 3, choosing a corner table that offered privacy while maintaining a clear view of the entrance. Brooke appeared 5 minutes later, looking markedly different from both the confident paralegal who had caught Robert's eye and the distressed young woman who had appeared on my doorstep. Her hair was styled in a professional bob, her attire tasteful but understated, the image of a rising attorney rather than an ornamental office accessory. Thank you for meeting me, she said, slipping into the seat across from me. I wasn't sure you would. Curiosity is a powerful motivator, I admitted. Congratulations on the partnership offer. Harrington and Walsh doesn't promote quickly. No, they don't, she agreed. Which is why I wanted to talk to you. I know this didn't happen by coincidence. I raised an eyebrow. What exactly are you suggesting? I've done my research, Miranda. Harrington and Walsh received a substantial investment from a Singapore entity last quarter, right before they created this new partnership position, and selected me from a pool of more senior associates. She was sharper than I had given her credit for. The investment had been made through a different entity than those connected to Saxon and Reed, but the timing wasn't coincidental. Investment decisions are made based on potential return, I said noncommittally. Harrington and Walsh has an excellent track record for developing talented attorneys. Like me? She asked directly. Perhaps. She studied me for a moment. Why would you help me after what happened with Robert? I'd have understood if you used your influence to blackball me from every decent firm in the city. It was a fair question, one I had asked myself when arranging the Harrington and Walsh opportunity. Contrary to what Robert might believe, I don't consider you the villain in this story, I explained. You were young, ambitious, and manipulated by someone in a position of power and authority. I was a willing participant, she countered. Were you? Or were you responding to subtle pressures and incentives created by a system that rewards women for being attractive to powerful men and punishes them for challenging the status quo? She considered this, absently stirring her coffee. Both? Probably. But that doesn't absolve me of responsibility. No, I agreed. It doesn't. But it does suggest you deserve the opportunity to build a career based on your actual talents, rather than your relationship with Robert. And you facilitated that opportunity, she stated, rather than asked. I made an introduction, I clarified. Your performance during the interview process and your work since joining the firm earned the partnership offer. With some invisible support, she added perceptively. I smiled slightly. The world runs on invisible support, Brooke. The difference is whether you acknowledge it or believe you succeeded entirely through your own merit. She nodded slowly. I've learned that lesson quite thoroughly these past few months. She hesitated before continuing. Have you heard from Robert recently? Not since his attempt at reconciliation 3 months ago, I replied. Has he contacted you? He calls sometimes, usually late at night. She looked down at her coffee. I don't answer anymore. He's not the same person I thought I was leaving you for. Few people are, once the carefully constructed facade slips. He's drinking too much, she said quietly. Talking about what might have been. It's uncomfortable. I absorbed this information with less satisfaction than I might have expected. Robert's decline wasn't my objective, just the natural consequence of his choices and the removal of my support. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and meant it. For both of you. Don't be, she replied with unexpected firmness. It was a necessary awakening for both of us. We sat in surprisingly comfortable silence for a moment. I have a question, she said finally. Something I've wondered since that night you explained everything to me. Go ahead. Why did you do it? Support Robert's career so extensively while allowing him to believe it was all his own achievement. Why not ensure he understood the role you played? It was the same question Marcus had asked me years ago when I first began establishing the investment structures. The answer was complex and deeply personal. Partly because I believed that was what partners did, supported each other without keeping score, I explained. And partly because Robert's ego required the illusion of self-made success. Acknowledging my role would have diminished his sense of accomplishment. That's remarkably generous, Brooke observed. Not generous, I corrected her. Strategic. Our marriage functioned better when Robert felt confident and successful. I was willing to remain invisible if it created harmony. Until he betrayed that arrangement, she added. Until he made decisions based on a fundamental misunderstanding of his own success, I clarified. Had he left me for someone else while fully recognizing what he was walking away from? At least it would have been an informed choice. Brooke nodded thoughtfully. And now? What happens next for you? The question echoed Marcus's earlier concern. What indeed came next in a life no longer defined by my marriage to Robert? I haven't decided, I admitted. For 15 years, my personal and professional decisions were filtered through the lens of our partnership. Now I have the freedom to reconsider everything. It's terrifying, isn't it? Brooke said with unexpected insight. That moment when you realize you're completely free to redefine yourself. I studied her with newfound appreciation. Perhaps there was more substance to Brooke Reynolds than I had initially recognized. Yes, I agreed. Terrifying. And exhilarating. As our conversation concluded and we prepared to leave, Brooke hesitated. Would it be completely inappropriate if we did this? Again sometime? Not regularly, just occasionally. I think I could learn a lot from you. The request surprised me, but not unpleasantly. I think that could be arranged. Walking back to my office, I found myself smiling at the irony. Of all the unexpected outcomes from Robert's betrayal, forming a cautious mentorship with the woman, he left me for certainly ranked among the most surprising. My phone buzzed with a text from Caroline. Dinner tomorrow night? Just us girls. No shop talk, no divorce talk, no law firm drama. Just good food, better wine, and conversation that doesn't involve men or money. For the first time in months, I felt a genuine eagerness for something unrelated to work or the aftermath of my divorce. I'll bring the wine, I replied. Perhaps Marcus was right. Perhaps it was time to explore what life looked like beyond the walls I had built around myself. Walls that had once protected a marriage, then shielded me during its dissolution, but now might be limiting rather than sheltering. The final chapter of this story was still unwritten. And for once, I was content to let it unfold without a meticulously crafted strategic plan. 1 year to the day after Robert had announced his intention to leave our marriage, I stood on the balcony of my Santorini villa, watching the Mediterranean sunset paint the whitewashed buildings in shades of gold and rose. The 2-week sabbatical had been Marcus's idea, a forced disconnection from the daily operations of Emerson Financial to mark the anniversary of what he called the Great Recalibration. You've earned this, he had insisted, practically packing my suitcase himself. The Singapore expansion is complete, the Anderson merger exceeded projections, and the restructuring at Saxon & Reed is fully implemented. Take time to breathe. Miranda. Surprisingly, I had found myself surrendering to the wisdom of his suggestion. 12 months of relentless focus on business had yielded remarkable results, but had left little space for personal reflection. This anniversary seemed an appropriate moment to pause and assess not just what I had accomplished, but who I had become in the aftermath of my marriage's collapse. My phone chimed with a text from Caroline. How's the Mediterranean treating you? William says the sunset photos you sent look fake, too perfect to be real. I smiled, snapping another picture of the horizon ablaze with color and sending it with the caption, entirely real, unlike most things William encounters in his legal practice. Caroline and I had settled into an unexpected friendship over the past year, one built on shared experiences and mutual respect, rather than our former connection through marriage and the firm. Her husband, William, had transitioned gracefully to his senior counsel role at Saxon & Reed, seemingly relieved to be freed from daily management responsibilities. Another message arrived, this one from Diane Levinson. Reminder, the Women in Finance. Mentorship program launches next month. Still want you as keynote speaker? Absolutely, I confirmed. The program had been my idea. A structured mentorship initiative connecting established female financial leaders with promising young women beginning their careers. The kind of support network I would have benefited from 20 years ago. I set my phone aside, determined to honor my promise to Marcus about truly disconnecting during this sabbatical. The business would survive 2 weeks without my constant attention. The past year had proven that the structures I built were sound, capable of thriving even as I stepped back to create space for my leadership team to grow. Taking a sip of local wine, I reflected on the changes of the past 12 months. Saxon. And Reed had transformed under Eliza Harmon's leadership, implementing governance reforms that had attracted positive industry attention. My investment entities had maintained their support of the firm, gradually increasing capital flow as each reform benchmark was achieved. Robert had eventually accepted an of-counsel position, a respectable role that acknowledged his legal skills while removing him from partnership authority. According to Caroline, he had finally embraced sobriety 3 months ago after a particularly humiliating incident at a client dinner. His new apartment was modest but comfortable, his lifestyle aligned with his actual means rather than the inflated status he had once projected. Brooke had thrived at Harrington and Walsh, her junior partnership quickly translating into significant client relationships. Our occasional coffee meetings had evolved into a genuine mentorship, with clear boundaries and mutual respect. She had recently begun dating an emergency room doctor, someone entirely outside the legal world and refreshingly uncomplicated compared to Robert. As for me, the year had brought its own evolution. Emerson Financial had expanded into 3 new markets. My personal investment portfolio had diversified beyond traditional sectors. I had joined 2 prestigious boards and established a foundation focused on financial literacy for women. The visible manifestations of success that had once remained deliberately in the background while Robert occupied the spotlight. But more significant than these professional achievements were the personal changes. I had learned to create space for friendship, for leisure, for interests beyond business strategy and investment returns. The walls I had built during my marriage, barriers that had both protected and isolated me, were gradually coming down, allowing for new connections and experiences. My phone chimed again, disrupting my reflection. An unfamiliar number with a New York area code. Against my better judgment, I checked the message. "It's Robert. I know you're traveling." No need to respond. "Just wanted to say I finally understand what you tried to tell me a year ago. Actions have consequences, but they also create opportunities for growth. I'm better for having lost everything you provided." Hard lesson, but necessary. Be well, Miranda. I stared at the message, surprised by both its content and my reaction to it. There was no anger, no lingering resentment, just a quiet acknowledgement that Robert's journey had been necessary for both of us. His loss had been my liberation, painful as the process had been. After a moment's consideration, I typed a simple reply. "Growth suits you. Stay well, Robert." Setting the phone down, I returned my attention to the sunset painting the horizon in magnificent colors. There was a metaphor there, I supposed. Beauty, emerging from the day's end, new possibilities born from what appeared to be an ending. My sabbatical journal lay open on the table beside me, filled with reflections from the past 2 weeks. Unlike the strategic plans and financial projections that usually occupied my writing time, these pages contained something more personal. Thoughts about the future I wanted to create now that I was fully untethered from the past. I picked up my pen and added a final entry. 1 year ago today, I believed I was facing the end of something essential, a partnership that had defined 15 years of my life. What I couldn't see then was that it was actually a beginning. The dismantling of that relationship revealed not just Robert's dependence on my support, but my own dependence on a role I had outgrown. The wife who silently facilitated her husband's success while diminishing her own light no longer exists. The woman who emerged from that marriage's collapse is stronger, more visible, and perhaps most importantly, more authentic. Robert's betrayal was painful, but it was also unexpectedly liberating. It forced me to reconsider not just who I was, in relation to him, but who I wanted to be in relation to myself. The revelation he experienced when discovering the truth about his success was mirrored by my own revelation, that I had been complicit in the illusion, allowing my contributions to remain invisible for the sake of his ego and our marital harmony. Never again. Whatever comes next, it will be on my terms, in full visibility, without apology for my capabilities or achievements. The investments I make, financial and emotional, will be in people and endeavors that recognize their value, not those who take them for granted. This anniversary marks not the end of a marriage, but the beginning of a life unapologetically lived in full view. And for that unexpected gift, I can almost find gratitude for Robert's betrayal. I closed the journal, feeling a sense of completion that had eluded me throughout the past year of strategic maneuvering. The story of my marriage to Robert Saxon, its dissolution and aftermath, had reached its conclusion. Whatever epilogue might follow would be an entirely new narrative, one in which I was both author and protagonist. My phone buzzed once more. Marcus, checking in despite my instructions to contact me only for genuine emergencies. The Anderson team sent their final acquisition proposal. Numbers look good, but they're requesting your personal involvement in the transition leadership. No rush, just wanted you to know what's waiting when you return. I smiled, appreciating both his thoroughness and his respect for my sabbatical. Thank you. We'll review when I'm back. Everything else stable, all systems operating smoothly. Enjoy your remaining time off. The business will survive without you for another week. Setting the phone aside, I watched the final sliver of sun disappear beyond the horizon. The sky deepened to indigo, stars emerging one by one into the darkening canopy. In the village below, lights flickered on, creating a mirror image of the constellations above. Tomorrow, I would explore the island, perhaps visit the archaeological sites or take the sailing excursion recommended by my villa host. The day after, maybe the cooking class featuring local ingredients and traditional techniques. Each day unfolding according to inclination rather than obligation, a luxury I had rarely permitted myself during 15 years of marriage or the intense year that followed its collapse. The night air carried the scent of jasmine and sea salt, reminding me that I was thousands of miles from the life I had carefully reconstructed after Robert's departure. Distance provided perspective, and perspective confirmed what I had suspected throughout the past year's journey. The revelation that had shaken Robert's understanding of his success had similarly transformed my understanding of myself. He had discovered that his achievements were not entirely self-made, that invisible support had facilitated his rise. I had discovered that my strength was not defined by that support role, that my capabilities extended far beyond what our marriage had allowed me to express. His funding had been cut off, forcing a painful recalibration of his identity and lifestyle. My constraints had been removed, allowing an expansion into spaces I had previously avoided for the sake of harmony. In the end, perhaps we had both received exactly what we needed, if not, what we initially wanted. Robert had gained humility and self-awareness through loss. I had gained freedom and authenticity through release. As the stars multiplied across the darkened sky, I raised my glass in a silent toast, not to the end of a marriage or the satisfaction of consequences delivered, but to the beginning of a life lived without invisible constraints. The revelation was complete. The next chapter was waiting to be written, and this time, I would write it entirely in my own hand. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.